Hey y'all, how's it going? It's Mia, and today we are going to be talking about House of the Dragon Episode 1. Yeah, the series premiere. And if you've been sticking around with me on my channel, you might have known that I was on the fence about reviewing this series. I'm like, I don't know if I want to commit to it. But last night I was like, you know what, I'm just going to watch this. And if I have anything to say about it, then sure, I'll make a kind of review video about it, and if not, then so be it. And here I am many words later with a ton to say about House of the Dragon, and for good reason, because it was really good. Do you all agree with me that it was a really wonderful start? I will say though, I think if you have not watched Game of Thrones, maybe it's just me, but it feels like if you weren't into it before, I don't think, or if you've never watched it before, I don't quite think that this is the show for you to be diving into. And you can see as well, they set up a couple of different kind of little sort of fan servicey moments that relate back to Game of Thrones. So it does feel like Thrones is required watching for this, unless it changes as things go on. But yeah, I was very pleasantly surprised. The one thing though in particular with this episode is that it was very dense. I like from the beginning, I was like, okay, I know I'm gonna have to keep subtitles on, because if I don't, I'm gonna miss something, or I'm gonna miss somebody's name, or I'm gonna miss, some sort of information, because I'm a casual Game of Thrones fan, like I know enough, but I'm not like, knee deep into the lore. So I'm like, I need to be focused on everything that they're saying, just because this is the setup episode. And so I was like, I expected it to be kind of very dense. So I am glad that they set some of that up. And then there's some other stuff in between as well. But I'm wondering if we will get past that at some point, where there's just, eventually we get caught up on the lore and now we can just kind of focus on present moments. But unfortunately, I'm like, I do know that there is a timeline jump at some point, whether it be episode 2 or depending, how long they want to drag this out, because there are adult versions, I don't know, spoiler, but there are adult versions of Alicent and Rhaenyra cast in the series. So I'm like, okay, once they grow up, we have that other time jump. Are we going to have to spend more time kind of filling in the gaps between what happened when they were, young adults to now that they're all grown up? So who knows, but they did a good job so far of getting up to speed on everything, that I wouldn't mind, if they have to kind of fill us in again, so be it. Now, another thing that I was wondering, I've been pondering this like the entire time. This has been a big question of like, is this just a repeat of Game of Thrones, or will it have its own feel to it? And I have to say personally, just because it is grounded in the Game of Thrones world, it's hard for me to be like, this is a completely different series, it has a completely different feel to it. I'm one of those people who are like, Game of Thrones is Game of Thrones. It's really hard to separate those two for me. So I don't know if you all felt any different. Did it feel like its own series? Or I wouldn't say it felt like a Game of Thrones repeat in a bad sense. I mean, you kind of need that sort of familiarity, especially for some of us who just really loved Game of Thrones as a series and want to see that kind of stuff again. And, like, well, I haven't read the books, or I don't know all this stuff. So you kind of do need some familiarity. The one thing I will say, though, is that Game of Thrones does a lot of kind of, I guess, jumping around, right? You always have a lot of characters. You have to keep track of what Jon Snow is doing and where he's going and who his entourage is, and Daenerys and who her entourage is. And, sometimes you're hanging with Jaime, or sometimes Jaime meets up with Brienne, or sometimes you're with Arya, and then Arya meets. So it's a lot. And so with this in House of the Dragon, it felt very, I don't know if linear is the word, but it felt a lot more controlled, in the sense of like, okay, we've got King Viserys. I'm like, am I saying these names? Is this the person who I need to be talking about? Right, yeah, you have King Viserys, and we know his whole hang up right now is that he wants an heir. He wants a male heir, and he's really tied up on that. And then in the end, blah blah blah, he skips ahead and then decides to choose his daughter as his successor. So that was pretty straightforward. I would say the only kind of going off the rails in a way that we had was the whole setup with Matt Smith's character Daemon, who plays his brother, and you can tell that there's some things not even bubbling underneath the surface, but pretty much very on the surface between those two, because I mean, hey, he essentially got kicked out of the kingdom at the end of the episode. But as far as like having these kind of multi-plot and having to keep up with all these characters at once, we'll see how this progresses as the season goes on. I think Game of Thrones, for the most part, did a really great job of balancing all these characters and all the things that they're trying to do. So it makes me wonder, because this is a bit more of a civil war plot within House Targaryen, pretty much. Will it be a little more self-contained? Thrones is spanning all these, we've got Stark and Baratheon, all these people. So I'm like, will it be a little easier to follow, in the sense that it's much more controlled? Or is it still going to kind of explode in its own of like, okay, well, this person has ulterior motives, Master of Coins has his ulterior motives, the Hand, all these different people. So I don't know yet. That remains to be seen. But again, I think if they can handle it as well as Thrones did, then that won't be a problem. Another thing that stuck out to me was the characters. And it's funny, this is a brand new cast, but the characters have already begun to grow on me. Let me know if you felt the same way. Because number one, acting, I think, was pretty stellar across the board. And these characters, some of them are familiar. You can grab like elements from some of the other casts, but for the most part, they feel like brand new characters. These are people who you can, either love to hate to love. And it makes me wonder, like, will any of these characters become like big pop culture icons in the way that Jon Snow or like Daenerys or, some of the others have become? Basically, will they be put in, what is that, multiverses? Warner Brothers, Smash Brothers ripoff. Anyway, that's an aside. I think I had seen a lot of people so far really like Rhaenyra, and I think that is 100% agreeable. She's one of those headstrong characters. She's kind of, plays by her own rules. In a way, gives off an Arya Stark kind of thing, but also it seems like she is willing to rule. She does want to sit on the throne. And then Daemon as well. Isn't he just a bag of fun? I think like Matt Smith does a really awesome job in this. Completely different from his 11th Doctor and Doctor Who. I was like, there's no way that Matt Smith can pull off being an a-hole, and I'm like, oh, he can. He's a British actor, and I should have never doubted him. But yeah, especially with Daemon, like there's the whole relationship that they set up with him and his brother, right? Like Viserys did care about him. He wanted him to be on his high council, and he kind of just gave him the middle finger. You didn't see that. And Daemon he didn't show up at all to any of the meetings and things like that. And so then he comes back all of a sudden, and there's some tension because it's like, hey, you kind of just massacred a whole town. It's not really what I was asking you to do when I was telling you to do your job. So and with him being banished, it's kind of like, okay, ooh, this is really interesting. I like what they're setting up. And, you can kind of already see the seeds that have been dropped with the tension for, who is going to be the next successor on the Iron Throne, which throne room looked awesome, by the way. Weren't we so happy to see that with all like the melted knives on the steps and things like that? Really, really good job there. And really, I just have some more like random things to talk about. Some like awesome little things and awesome little scenes. Like in the beginning, the kind of title introduction sequence that they set up, kind of telling you, hey, this is 127 years for Daenerys Targaryen. I was like, that's good for us normies who are like, hey, what the heck is going on here? What do we need to know? So I'm glad that they included that in there. Man, I really wanted to hear the theme song for House of the Dragon. Like, obviously nothing beats but HBO has some of the best iconic openings in all of television. Just, Game of Thrones, Succession, like best openings. So I'm fingers crossed. I'm like, I think next episode they should have their opening. I'm really looking forward to it because that's just, I can never bring myself to skip Westworld as well. I can never bring myself to skip those openings. So fingers crossed for that. And another thing that surprised me was the budget for this. Now, I think it's no surprise now that pretty much everything that comes on streaming is going to have a CG budget. I mean, She-Hulk has a CG budget, Sandman has a CG budget, but it just, compared to the olden days, which was some odd 9-10 years ago, like when Game of Thrones first came out, you remember that was like a big deal to be like, where are the dragons? When are we gonna get dragons? Do you have the budget for dragons? And a lot of the sets for the original Game of Thrones felt really practical. The scenes looked really practical because I honestly do not think that HBO had the money to do anything different. So they have come a really long way, you know, seeing how they've CG'd King's Landing, or you know, seeing like you can have an opening shot with a dragon on day one, guys. That is progress, man. So that was just interesting to see. And I'm sure towards the end everyone kind of loved the father-daughter talk between Viserys and Rhaenyra, and he's telling her about all these things coming up, you know, talking about the prophecy of, you know, the winter is coming. And what did he say? He said Aegon called his dream the Song of Ice and Fire. And weren't we all like, oh, that's the thing? You know? That being said, given the way that season 8 went, I was like, well, I think your ancestor is making a little bit of a exaggeration here. I think especially just because the way, like, thinking about how Arya killed the Night King, it was like, oh, okay, he's dead. After all those years of build up, one little stabby and he's dead. I was like, okay. But again, I do like the callback anyway, because it's just one of those things that, again, helps you be grounded into the series, bridging this to or from Game of Thrones, however you want to look at it. And then not only that, I think during her sort of coronation scene, when you had some of the houses pledging their allegiance to her, like you saw House Stark, I think there's a House Baratheon, I'm not sure, but it was just kind of interesting. Like, hey, those are the familiar things that I remember. And all of a sudden, Game of Thrones, I forgive you for season 8. Okay, and last thing before I completely lose my mind, and it's funny how much fun I'm having discussing this. There are a lot of scenes that had me on the edge of my seat. You know, like sometimes they're talking and they're getting through the nitty gritty, but then they bring the action. Even just like the birthing scene, the whole cesarean section thing. I was like, oh no, just like the look on the queen's face. He's like, okay, something is about to happen. And she's like, what is about to happen? I shouldn't even get into the gruesomeness of it, but I was like, oh, they're gonna, oh, wow, oh no, I feel so horrible. And then pairing that up with the kind of intensity of the jousting scene, and I'm like, is Matt Smith gonna get his head bashed in the first episode? No way. Of course he yielded, thank God. But yeah, some brutal stuff going on. And even just the whole the Golden Cloaks as well, right? They're the city guard going out and just, you know, causing mayhem all over the place and chopping up and oh my god. That's the one thing about Game of Thrones that makes me a little uneasy, and it's why I had to stop watching it for a minute, because I get really kind of queasy and squeamish, and I cannot stand any sort of like butchering or things like that. So that's the one thing I'm like, this can happen at any minute, any scene of Game of Thrones, and I just have to kind of brace myself for it. And I'm gonna be honest, I had my eyes closed or like watching like this like a child pretty much through that whole scene, because I simply could not. So yeah, I had fun watching House of the Dragon. I will admit, I am back. I am pulled back into Game of Thrones. Grr, you HBO. But yeah, let's see. I might come back next week, talk about episode 2. I don't know, maybe if I find it so particularly compelling. But what I want to know is how you guys felt about House of the Dragon, the premiere episode, just because, you know, again, there was a lot of divisiveness, especially following season 8. But I think for the most part, everyone has been on House of Dragon's side. Everyone has been kind of excited for this, to give them a second chance. And hey, I'll leave that to you guys in the comments. Let me know what you thought. What were some of your favorite scenes? Will you be coming back to watch episode 2? Because I certainly will. Otherwise, I had an awesome video discussion with a friend of mine who is also a huge Game of Thrones fan, where we discussed The Sandman Season 1. So if you would like to go over to that, I have the video here. Check out that discussion. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, subscribe for more discussions, and I'll see you next time, guys. Bye.